This is Damon Fordham, author, historian, and adjunct professor of history at the Citadel as well as Charleston Southern University. Now, most of you, of course, know about Mother Emanuel AME Church, which unfortunately is best known for the fact that on the night of June the 17th, 2015, 9 parishioners, including the pastor who I knew pretty well, Reverend Clemente Pinckney, were assassinated by a terrorist by the name of Dylan Roof, who is currently serving a death sentence in Indiana for that crime. But it's a historically African-American church with some interesting stories behind it, not the least of which is as follows. On their current website, they have on Facebook, they have this picture on the website. You see seated here above the names Mother Emanuel. Right here, this is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. sitting there at the church about to preach on April the 12th, 1962. And the gentleman in the pulpit who is introducing him is Charleston's own great leader, Mr. Esau Jenkins. Now, many of you might have seen the video that I had with Mr. Jenkins earlier, but essentially, for those of you who don't know, here's the quick version of his story. He was born on July the 4th, 1910 in nearby rural Johns Island, and grew up in poverty and didn't get past the 4th grade, but he was self-educated and went on to not only own several businesses, including the C&O Credit Union that exists to this day over some 46 years after he was killed in a car crash on October the 30th, 1972. But he also was the head of the Charleston Southern Christian Leadership Conference that Dr. King organized in Charleston. And he would take a lot of the unregistered voters and take them in a bus to register to vote in Charleston at much risk to his life and safety. Anyway, he spoke ahead of Martin Luther King. And I fortunately, in doing some research, I found a newspaper account of his sermon at Mother Emanuel that day, where it says, Negro leader urges voter registration. This is from the Charleston News and Courier of April the 13th, 1962, the very next day. And among other things, he praised the leadership of Mr. Jenkins. He said, I admire those working for freedom in the community like Brother Jenkins over here. And I once spoke to a man by the name of Robert Crawford, who was a photographer. He was a young boy at the time Dr. King spoke at Mother Emanuel, and he was there with his mother to see him. And he spoke of the feeling of desperation and hopelessness of many Black people in those days of darkest segregation and very little opportunity. Unfortunately, a lot of that culture of despair has been passed down through the generations. And he spoke of how Dr. King's speech was one of the first things that gave him hope that things could be better than the segregated existence that they were living at that time, because he didn't see any advancement. He saw people locked in poverty and unable to move to better conditions for the most part. And so when Dr. King spoke, it gave him a window of hope and opportunity, something that's always been greatly needed, because if you cannot have any hope, you do not have the motivation to advance, and that's important. But getting back to what he said that day, Dr. King went on to say that they must challenge this system of segregation and make it clear that we don't like it, but the key, he said, was the vote. And he spoke of the idea that South Carolina was low in the actual people registered to vote. And that he said that the 2-year goal was to increase voter registration in the South from 1.3 million African Americans to about 4 million Blacks. And he said that, don't you know that if they increased the number of Black voters, not only would that help take care of the problem of segregation, he said, but, quote, don't you know that the governor of South Carolina would talk in different terms and sing a new tune? Here's something to consider. The governor of South Carolina at that time was Ernest Fritz Hollings. In those days, Ernest Fritz Hollings was speaking out in favor of segregation. In fact, 5 years later, in 1967, he would vote against confirming Thurgood Marshall as the first black Supreme Court justice. But however, 1 year after Dr. King's speech, as more black people began to register to vote in South Carolina, he said at the State House that the state was running out of courts, and so therefore it was necessary for them to integrate Clemson with Harvey Gantt, a graduate of Charleston's Burke High School, as the first black student to attend that university. Now, the triple irony here is that I was at the University of South Carolina on January the 20th, 1986, which was the first federal King holiday. And a bunch of us went, after class, we went to the State House to enjoy the first King Day program in South Carolina, as a federal holiday. And one of the speakers himself was Senator and former Governor Ernest Fritz Hollings. And this is what he had to say about Martin Luther King. And for those of you who are familiar with Senator Hollings, this is exactly how he speaks. I read Dr. King when he wrote in the letter for the Birmingham jail. And when I read that letter, it made me realize how wrong that segregation was, and Martin Luther King's teachings turned me away from the teachings of segregation. And from that day forward, I understood. Well, whether, one could say what they will about the sincerity of those words, but who of us knows what was in his heart? But the fact remains that Dr. King said that if more people began to register in greater numbers, that the governor would sing a new tune. And certainly, he was definitely speaking in different terms than he did before a lot of African Americans were registering. And the point of that is this. Today a lot of people are angry because of the actions and the deeds of various politicians. But the question to ask these people when they're angry about the direction of their political leaders is, did you vote? You see, if you do not like what your officials in power are saying or doing, it is up to you to get other people together, to organize and register to vote. You see, back in 1915, there was a man named Joe Hill who was executed for his labor activities. And as he faced the firing squad and the death penalty, he said, don't mourn, organize, so that whenever you have a leader in elected office who you feel are doing things that are contrary to the public good and to your liking, it's up to you. Don't mourn, organize, then register, and then vote, and then see to it that they're replaced by those who are more to your liking. And that is the lesson of what happened when Dr. King spoke at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina on April the 12th, 1962. This is Damon Fordham.